Okay, this isn't going to be one of my normal videos related to militia type things. We're going to go into the survival type category. I've said for a while, stock as much food as you can. And I've also mentioned to, plant a garden and learn to preserve what you grow. And in this video, I'm going to give you some ideas on some of the types of basic things you're going to need for canning, either pressure canning or water bath canning. This is going to be the basic type stuff. There's a lot of other materials out there and tools you can use in this. I'm just going to give you the basics so that you can possibly start out on your own. Now, first off, you're going to need information. A lot of people swear by this, the Ball Blue Book. There is a lot of recipes in here. Some good, some I kind of question, like jalapeno jelly. I'm sure some people like it, but for me personally, it's kind of out there. There are other good sources that you should also look into. I will put a link to some things in the description of the video, and I also do a pinned comment to different sites. One site that I highly recommend is the University of Georgia food preservation website. They are the go-to for everything for food preservation. If you go look at USDA and that stuff, what their recommendations are, they actually link to that site. That is what I use as my primary source. Do not go by grandma and great-grandma's recipes. Okay, you can look at that, but then look at how it may have changed to make it more safer to prevent things like botulism and food poisoning and your stuff breaking down, far too quickly. Another source that I highly recommend is there is a magazine, or at least was a magazine, known as Backwoods Home Magazine. One of their editors was by the name of Jackie Clay. Jackie Clay has been homesteading for decades, about 50 to 60 years, I think, is how long she's been on a homestead. She has written multiple books on food preservation, including canning. Get a hold of those. Those are also good resources. Now we're going to go into some of the tools here. First off, obviously, jars. And they come in many different sizes, from your 1 cups or half pints to your pints to your quarts. And there's even larger than that. There is half-gallon jars out there, or 2-quart jars, but really those should only be used for pickling and pretty much nothing else. You might be able to get away with canning meat inside the half-gallon jars, but they're probably going to be meats that you're going to have to make sure has a pretty good salt content to them to help prevent problems with bacteria. When you look at instructions for canning, they give you instructions for up to quarts. But of the jars, you're going to have 2 basic types. You're going to have regular mouth, and you're going to have wide mouth. You see the difference in the diameters on these. Both of these are your 1 cup or half pint jars. Typically these are used for like jellies and jams. The next step up from that is your 1 pint jars, and believe it or not, this tall bugger here is a 1 pint jar, because you read on the side on this one, it actually shows it goes up to 16 ounces, which is 1 pint. And then it goes up to like 18 ounces, but you're only going to fill it probably up to about the 1 pint mark. Now over here, same thing, you got your quart jars. These are the primary for pretty much anything, from pickling to fruit, you know, I'm not talking jams and jellies. I'm talking like sugared fruits and that type of stuff. Things like apple sauces, spiced apples, and that type of stuff. You know, this is your average jar. And it's just like these. You have regular mouth and wide mouth. Now, all of these that you see here are actual mason jars, actual canning jars. Your actual canning jars typically are going to have a name of the company on the side of the jar. Usually, there are some off-brands that don't. You usually find these at like Walmart and that stuff. They're okay. Your mason jars are a thicker jar than what you would get in a store. Now, there is conflicting information on this, and I'm going to point this out. You will find information that says you cannot use regular jars for canning. That's not necessarily correct. If the jar will take a corresponding lid, you can with it. This is an old Miracle Whip jar, probably from the 1980s. The mouth size on this corresponds to wide mouth. And I know I got a wide mouth here. Over here we got a smaller jar that probably was for a jelly or a jam from a couple decades ago, from 30, 40 years ago. Size on this one corresponds to regular mouth. The lids work. Now, can you can with these jars? Yes. But here's the caveat. You can only water bath these types of jars. Mason jars, you can water bath them, you can pressure can them. But with your regular jars, your non-masons, they can only be water bathed. The glass is not strong enough to handle and survive pressure canning. And some people will actually recommend that with your non-mason jars that you can in, that you should only do fermented or pickled foods inside. Nothing that has a high sugar content because of the possibility of losing seals and that type of stuff. But you run that risk with any jar, even the mason jars. So you can with the non-mason jars if you get a good solid seat with a corresponding size for a canning lid. Either your ring for the regular mouth or a ring for wide mouth. Now, you can buy jars in cases at store. They're sold in cases of 12. They will come with the jar, with a ring, with a brand new lid on it. All that stuff can be used. Do not wash the lid from a brand new case before you use it. Don't worry about that. It's perfectly fine, perfectly sanitary at the moment. When you actually get into prepping the lid for putting on a jar, that's when it's going to get sanitized. So as long as that lid didn't come off the jar, fall in a trash can, fall on the floor, you wiped your butt and then you handled it without washing your hands, that lid is perfectly fine. Now, outside of getting them as cases of brand new jars at store, you're probably going to find them at garage sales or auctions. I have gotten a lot of jars over the years from garage sales and auctions. Usually the auction is the better buy because you can buy a larger case of jars of say 30, 40 or 50 or more jars in a giant cardboard box, and the price will spread out a little bit more even, you know, when you average it across each of the jars. When you go to a garage sale, I find that a lot of people jack up the price, especially if it's an older looking jar or one that they don't recognize. The two main companies that you are going to find on the market is Ball and Care or Kier. These used to be two separate companies. They were the primary competitors across the mason jar company or industry, but Ball bought out Kier some years ago, and you will find that Kier products now have the Ball label and small print on them. Now I'm going to show you some things to look for when you get jars at auctions or anywhere else. Now you're probably looking at this jar and you think that's disgusting, you shouldn't use that. No, you can wash this up, re-sanitize it, and it's perfectly fine. And you know what? Both of these two jars back here a week ago looked exactly like this. They came from the same location, actually came from a basement. From a relative's house. They sent me some cases of jars in the mail. Luckily, they all survived magically. And they all looked like this. These jars had been down in the basement at least 40 years, probably 50 years since they had last been used. And they all look like this and worse. But when you look at a jar at an auction or at a garage sale, first thing you go through, you look very closely, spinning the jar all the way around. Make sure that there is no hairline cracks or cracks anywhere in the jar. On the sides, on the bottoms, in the necks, anywhere. After you do that, take your finger, run it around the rim to see if there's any rough parts. If you feel any part up here that's rough, scratchy, get a good look at it. It could be just a little bit of residue on it, like some rust, and you can clean that off with a green scouring pad. But if there's a piece of glass missing in there, you can't use that jar. And mason jars cannot be recycled because of the thickness of the glass. They have to be thrown in the trash. Recyclers do not want glass from mason jars because they count it as a ceramic, not as glass. And a single jar like this and an entire trailer load of perfectly fine glass jars and bottles will result in that entire trailer getting dumped in a landfill. So, but go through, check your rim. If it's good, it feels smooth or relatively smooth, then you'll go through, check your threads, make sure your threads aren't all messed up. Now, how I wash these up when I get them like this, I don't put them in a sink. Usually I'll wash them in a bathtub first. I'll get a tub of soapy water in there using dish soap and a rag or a worn out dish brush, and I'll scrub them up thoroughly, rinse them off, set them off to the side, let them dry. Once they're dry, that's when I take them, put them in the sink with dish soap, wash them up good, put them in a strainer, let them drip dry. When I get enough of them to put in a canner, I do that, and then I sanitize them. Set them out, let them cool down, dry, and they're good as new. Like they just showed up at your house for the first time, fresh from the store. If you find any really crusty stuff on the jars, in the jars, scrub it as best you can to get it out. Use green scratch pads or whatever you have available, and then thoroughly rinse. If you know that jar that you're looking at was used to store anything other than a food product, like a petroleum product, like an oil, a grease, paint thinner or paint, that jar can never be used for food again. Just throw that one right in the trash or use it for that same purpose inside your workshop or garage. Probably gave you more information on jars than you thought you should get. Now, when you can, each jar that you're going to can has to have a ring that corresponds to the size of that jar, either a regular mouth or a wide mouth. You're also going to need a lid. Now the lids will come couple different ways. You can get packs of 12s like this, and they'll say on here whether it's a regular or wide mouth. Or if you need more rings, you can get them like this. You'll have the rings or the bands with the one-piece lids. Now the metal canning lids are single use. You use them only once, they're done, and you throw them in the trash. That's it. There are reusable canning lids on the market though. And this is an example of one company. This is Tattler. This is the type that I have. They've been around for decades. I found out about them. Damn, I hate springtime. I found out about them over on Survival Blog. They were recommended over there by survivalists and preppers as a alternative to this that you can reuse and reuse and reuse and reuse. How you use these is you have a two-piece lid, the plastic, and the rubber gasket. Each time you reuse it, you go through, you wash it up first, let it dry and that stuff. When you reuse that lid and that ring, you'll see an indentation on one side of the gasket. You put that side facing towards the lid and the flat side facing towards the jar. And then you flip back and forth as you reuse it. Whichever side has the most recent indentation, and you will see the difference. It'll only be on one side. That goes towards the lid. These can be used an indefinite number of times. I'm not even sure how many decades these last. There is another type of reusable canning lid out there, and I had to look it up. It is known as Harvest Guard. When you look at them on the pictures, they look the exact same as this. Now I should make the note with Tattlers, they do sell two different types of reusable lids. They have some that are marked Easy Seal, and then they have some that are just marked as reusables. Both of them get prepped a little bit differently, handled a little bit differently. There is videos over at the Tattler website that tells you how to use the two different types. There's not that much difference in them, but you know, there's just different techniques between the two types that increases your chances of success. I have had no problems with the Tattler lids when I've done water bath canning, but I have had a huge problem with them for pressure canning. I'm still trying to master that. If I got to do any pressure canning, I automatically, just out of habit right now, I go to the single-use metal lids because those I've had a 100% success rate. Where with the reusables, I'm running at about a 75 to 80% success rate. Now, I'll point out some of the tools. Now that we got the jars, you've picked your your bands, you got your lids, and you got your information. What are some of the tools you actually need to can stuff? First off, you're going to need a canner. This one is a water bath canner. This one over here is a pressure canner. Pressure canner is not too much different than what you have in a food processing plant, except this is obviously scaled down. You really, really need to make sure that your pressure canner meets current safety specs. There is a lot of old pressure canners out there that are missing some basic safety features. This is just your basic weight for trapping pressure inside. You should make sure you have a working gauge on top of the canner. And you should make sure you have this little safety plug on here. What happens with this, if the pressure inside gets too great, where you're starting to run the risk that this can rupture and turn into literally a bomb, This little rubber piece here comes shooting out and starts relieving the pressure. And it does it instantly. I don't remember the pressure that activates. I think it's like 40 pounds of pressure, maybe 50 pounds. I'm not sure. I know it's pretty high. The gauge on here for normal operation is up to 20. Once you get past 20, it goes into the caution. There is a note in the survivalist movement to get your pressure canners checked at your state's extension office every few years, just to make sure that the gauge is reading correctly, is still functioning, has not been damaged. Now there are, from my understanding, there's two different styles for pressure canners. One type is meant for use on an electric stove, the other is meant primarily on a gas stove. I think the one that I have here is meant for an electric stove, but it works just fine on a gas also. Over here you have your basic water bath canner, and all this is just a giant pot with a lid. Now when you put your jars in there, you're going to need a basket. This basket primarily is meant for with quart jars, but you can put pints on here also. They just don't have as much support. This basket holds 7 quarts. It's set up like this that you can put your jars on, lower them down into water inside here, drop them at the bottom, hold it in there, and then fill the remainder of the water that's needed. Your water must always be a 1/2 inch to 1 inch over the top of your jar before you start to heat up. You can learn a lot of that at the basics. If you look up that section over at the University of Georgia, they'll tell you the safety requirements for water bath canning. They're not that much. It's pretty straightforward. I know my mother, years ago when she got taught canning by my grandmother, they basically were taught or using the techniques that were used with the old single piece metal lids. And my mother was told never have the water over the top of the lid because the pressure won't escape the jar. It will. On the 2-piece lids for a jar, the band and the lid, water needs to be over the top to prevent air from getting back inside after it's been expelled from the jar. So now you can use either of these canners without this, and the pressure canner you're actually not supposed to use the basket. You use a plate. Now I have a couple different sizes here for the plate. This is actually the one that came with this canner. This goes down on the bottom. You never want your jar to touch the outside of the pot of either the pressure canner or the water bath. This does work down in the bottom of the water bath also. When I water bath a lot of pints and 1/2 pints, this is what I put down at the bottom and then put the jars over this. Now, depending on the height of your pressure canner, you can put this down in the bottom, and then depending on the size of the jars you have in there, you can potentially put this, a smaller one or one of equal size, over the top of the jars that are in there, and put another row of jars over the top if it will fit inside the canner, so that you can double the amount that you're working on. And I'll point this out. Keep your book that comes with your pressure canner. These also have recipes in them, along with a lot of important information you should know about your pressure canner. If you get one from a garage sale that doesn't have the booklet, see what information you can find on it, any type of markings, and then try doing a search online you might find someone has uploaded the old instruction book. So now we got our jars, basic information, we have our canners. Now we're going to talk about putting the stuff in the jars and handling the jars. Some tools that you really have to get. First off, a jar lifter or jar tongs. How this works. When this is hot, you just finished, it's done with its time, you've turned off the fuel to it. It's starting to cool down. When you're ready to remove the jars from here, you can either use the basket, or I just go through, use the jar tongs. You just go down in there, lift it up and out like so. And you do not have to handle a hot jar. Another piece of equipment you really need to have is a jar funnel. They come as plastic, and you'll also find these as old metal ones. Both of them work just fine. What this does is this prevents the stuff that you're putting into the jar from making a mess on top of your jar here before you put your lid on. Cuts down on it. Extremely handy, highly recommended. Another thing I recommend is a little magnet wand, or I refer to it as a lid lifter. This works with the metallic one-piece lids, single-use lids. When you simmer those to get them ready to put on top of the jar, you're not going to reach into that pan of hot water to grab that lid out and then put it on a jar. Use this, put it in the water, grab a single lid, pull it up and out, put it on top of your jar. Then take your finger, hold it in place, disconnect the lid, get it set on there good, and then you adjust the band accordingly to the instructions. Now, there are some materials that are pretty common across canning, depending on what you're doing. Materials, and these are your expendable materials, the things you need for your product inside. Most common things that you'll come across will be white wine vinegar. Your average vinegar in the store comes in your 1 gallons. Pickling salt. This is not the same as your iodized table salt. This is non-iodized. If you use iodized salt in canning, it actually causes the stuff that you put in a jar to discolor when it's put under heat or pressure. It'll actually turn kind of a purplish color. Now, there is a note I want to say on this. In an emergency, a survival situation, you run out of pickling salt, you can use plain salt or non-iodized salt. That does work. The texture might be a little different, the color might be a little bit different, but not by much. I came across one note that said that when doing pickles with plain salt, it just makes the brine look slightly more cloudy, but not extremely bad. Other common things that you will see in recipes include white sugar, not brown sugar, but I'm sure there's a few recipes out there that call for it. Your white sugar, your plain kitchen sugar. And another thing is a product called pectin. Pectin is P-E-C-T-I-N. That you use whenever you do jellies, jams, and preserves. Or at least I know you do for sure with jellies and jams. I haven't done preserves yet. I'm guessing it's part of it. What that does is it causes the fruit mix, the juice inside, to solidify and actually become the jelly, become the jam. So that's some of the basic items that are out there for canning. Basic things you need: jars, and choose the appropriate size for what you want to do. Lids, bands or rings, the canner, whichever type you want to use at that time. Everyone always starts with the water bath because it's the easiest. And the most common things that people start with is tomatoes, whole tomatoes, or pickles. Those are the easiest things to learn the basics of canning on. Actually, for me, my first thing that I canned was actually jams. But, you know, most people start out with pickles or tomatoes. And then you need your basic items for actually handling the jars and filling the jars themselves. This video is just on the types of basic equipment you need with canning. I'm not going to teach you the basic techniques with canning or recipes. There are channels out there that is all they do, is teach techniques and different recipes. Go check some of them out. Okay? See how they do this stuff so that you see with your own eyes how it's supposed to be done, so that when you go to the University of Georgia's website, you understand what they're talking about. You understand what they're talking about when they say 5 pounds of pressure or 10 pounds of pressure, depending on your height above sea level. You understand what they're talking about with headspace, how much to fill your jars, how to prep your jars. There's hot pack and there's cold pack. 2 different techniques, just depends on what you're putting in there. Is it a high acid, a low acid, you know, high sugar, no sugar, that type of thing. There's lots of information out there. Look it up, learn it. My goal is, my personal goal for this year is, every single canning jar I have, I want full by December 31st of this year. Not just from stuff from my garden. I want it to can stuff from farmers markets. I want to go to the stores when they have sales on stuff, get a bunch of it when I can afford it, and can it up also. I want my shelves filled. Why? I work in logistics, and let me just say, the outlook is not good for food for later this year. So, you know, if you can handle it, you want to give this a try, here's at least a starting point for you for equipment. Now, for everyone out there, not just my engineer brothers and sisters, but everyone across the survivalist communities, prepper communities, patriot communities, and militia communities, always remember, essayons, let us try.